These dishes aren't even worth half of what my mum has." Those words rang out in my small kitchen at 11:45 p.m. on New Year's Eve. I'm Margaret Sullivan, 68 years old, a former literature professor at Boston University for 30 years. In my hands, I was holding a white ivory Lenox plate, the last inheritance from my mother, now being mocked by my daughter-in-law Emily right in front of my son David. Her contemptuous laughter pierced my heart like needles. 40 years of sacrifice, selling my house to pay David's debts, covering all his rent, utilities, and expenses, only to hear these words from my future daughter-in-law's mouth. David sat there, eyes glued to his phone, silent as a statue. Not one word defending the mother who raised him since my husband passed away. In that moment, I realized I had been nurturing two ungrateful parasites. Have you ever been betrayed by your own child in the very home you're supporting them in? What I did next would have all of Boston talking. The silence that followed Emily's cruel words felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I set the Lenox plate down carefully on the counter, my hands trembling not from age, but from the surge of emotions I had been suppressing for far too long. The kitchen, once filled with the warm aroma of prime rib and the gentle hum of family conversation, now felt cold and sterile. "Mum, Emily didn't mean anything by it." David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, still not looking up from his phone. Even his defense was hollow, perfunctory, as if he was checking off a box on some invisible list of minimal filial duties. "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated slowly, my voice finding its strength. "She just insulted the only thing I have left of my mother, in my own kitchen, at the dinner table I've been setting for both of you for the past 3 years." Emily rolled her eyes dramatically, swirling her wine glass with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from years of practice. "Oh, please, Margaret. It's not like I said anything untrue. Those dishes are from what? The 1970s? My mother has a complete Hermes china set that's actually worth something." The casual way she said my name, not Mom, not even Mrs. Sullivan, hit me like a slap. I had been reduced to just Margaret, a roommate they barely tolerated, a financial convenience they had learned to manipulate with surgical precision. I thought back to how this all began. After my husband Thomas passed away 15 years ago, David was fresh out of college, drowning in student loan debt and struggling to find his footing in the world. I had opened my doors, my heart, and my checkbook without hesitation. What mother wouldn't? The apartment on Beacon Street wasn't cheap, but I had my professor's pension, some savings, and the small inheritance from Thomas's life insurance. It seemed manageable then, temporary even. "Just until I get on my feet, Mom," David had promised, his eyes sincere, his gratitude genuine. 6 months, maybe a year tops. That was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, I had watched my savings dwindle like sand through an hourglass. First, it was just the rent. $3,200 a month for the two-bedroom apartment in Back Bay. Then came the utilities, the groceries, the car payments, when David's Honda broke down and he absolutely needed transportation for job interviews. The job interviews that seemed to multiply endlessly, but never quite materialize into actual employment. When Emily entered the picture 2 years ago, things had shifted from concerning to catastrophic. She was a part-time social media coordinator for a small Providence television station, a job that paid barely enough to cover her designer coffee habit, let alone contribute to household expenses. But what she lacked in financial contribution, she made up for in audacity. I watched her redecorate my living room without asking, replacing my comfortable reading chair. The one where Thomas and I used to read Sunday morning papers together, with a sleek, uncomfortable modern monstrosity that she claimed was more aesthetically pleasing. She treated my home like her personal playground, my belongings like obstacles to her vision of sophisticated living. The worst part wasn't her entitlement, it was David's silence. My son, the boy I had carried for 9 months, nursed through midnight fevers, defended against playground bullies, and put through college by working double shifts at the university library, had become a stranger. He watched his fiancée dismantle the life I had built, and said nothing. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be a celebration. They had announced their engagement 3 months ago with a level of fanfare that would have made the Kardashians proud. Emily had posted the moment on Instagram with a caption that read, "He finally asked. Can't wait to start our forever in our beautiful Boston home. Our home." As if she had contributed a single penny to its existence. I had spent the entire day preparing this New Year's Eve dinner, hoping against hope that maybe this milestone would bring us closer together. I had used my mother's recipes, the ones I had learned by heart, watching her in our small kitchen in Southie. The prime rib had been seasoned since yesterday morning, the Yorkshire pudding batter rested to perfection, and I had even splurged on a bottle of Bordeaux that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But as I watched Emily photograph her plate before taking a single bite, angling the food for the perfect lighting while complaining about the dated presentation, I realized that I wasn't hosting a family dinner. I was providing content for her social media performance, unpaid catering for her lifestyle brand. The breaking point came when she picked up my mother's gravy boat, the one with the tiny chip on the handle that I refused to repair, because it reminded me of the Christmas morning when my brother accidentally knocked it against the oven door. Emily examined it with the clinical detachment of an appraiser, turning it over to check for maker's marks. "You know, Margaret," she had said, setting it down with a dismissive clink. "These pieces might have sentimental value to you, but they're really not worth much. My mother has this gorgeous Hermes set that was actually an investment. These—" She gestured vaguely at the table setting that represented 3 generations of my family's history. "These aren't even worth half of what my mum has." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything I held dear. In that moment, staring at this woman who had been living in my home, eating my food, and planning her future with my son's apparent blessing, I felt something inside me break. Not my heart. That had been cracking slowly over the past 3 years. What broke was my tolerance, my willingness to smile and nod, and pretend that love could survive in the absence of respect. I looked at David, really looked at him, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would acknowledge the profound disrespect his fiancée had just shown to his mother and his grandmother's memory. Instead, he was scrolling through his phone, probably liking Emily's latest Instagram post about their cozy family dinner. That's when I knew with crystal clarity that I had been living a lie. This wasn't family. This was exploitation dressed up in holiday traditions and forced smiles. These weren't the children I had raised and loved. They were strangers who had learned to speak the language of manipulation fluently enough to keep the money flowing. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a meal that had taken me all day to prepare, watching these 2 people treat my home like a hotel and my love like a credit line with no limit, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be their victim anymore. The next morning arrived with the kind of harsh January light that makes everything look stripped and honest. I woke up in my own bed, the bed I had been sleeping in alone for 15 years, while financially supporting 2 able-bodied adults in the next room. And for the first time in months, my mind was crystal clear. I made coffee in the kitchen where Emily's cruel words still seemed to echo off the walls, and I began to take inventory. Not of my possessions, but of my delusions. For 3 years, I had been telling myself stories to make their behavior acceptable. David was still grieving his father. The job market was tough. Emily came from a different background and needed time to adjust. They were young and still learning how to be adults. All lies. Comfortable lies that had allowed me to avoid the painful truth that I had been systematically manipulated and financially abused by my own son. I opened my laptop, the same one where I used to grade papers and write scholarly articles about the complex motivations of literary characters, and began to research. If I was going to confront this situation, I needed to understand it fully. What I found made my blood run cold. The legal term was elder financial abuse, and according to the National Council on Aging, it affected an estimated 5 million older adults annually, with total losses exceeding $36 billion. The perpetrators weren't strangers or scam artists calling from overseas. They were family members, caregivers, and trusted individuals who exploited their access to an older person's finances. Reading through case studies felt like reading my own diary. The gradual escalation of requests, the emotional manipulation, the way the victim was made to feel guilty for questioning excessive expenses or setting boundaries, the isolation that came when the older person began to resist, and the way other family members were turned against them or stayed silent to avoid conflict. I had become a textbook case, and I hadn't even realized it. That afternoon, I called my old colleague, Dr. Patricia Wainwright, who had retired from the psychology department 2 years before I did. Pat had always been the sharpest person in any room, with a particular expertise in family dynamics and manipulation tactics. "Maggie," she said, after I explained the situation, her voice mixing concern with something that sounded like relief. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years. What do you mean?" "Honey, everyone who knows you has watched this happen. We've all seen how tired you look, how you stopped coming to faculty events, how you always seemed stressed about money despite having a solid pension. But you seemed so committed to helping David, and none of us knew how to bring it up without sounding intrusive. The revelation that my exploitation had been visible to others was both humiliating and liberating. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone." "What do I do, Pat?" "You document everything," she said without hesitation. "And then you set boundaries with consequences. Real consequences. These aren't children anymore, Maggie. They're adults who have learned that your love has no limits, which means your resources have no protection." Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective investigating my own life. I gathered bank statements going back 3 years, printed out credit card records, and created a spreadsheet that made me physically nauseous. The numbers were stark and undeniable. $127,400. That's how much I had spent on David and Emily over the past 3 years. Rent, utilities, groceries, car payments, insurance, medical bills, dining out, shopping sprees, vacation contributions, and what Emily cheerfully called emergency expenses that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. But the money was only part of the story. I had also sacrificed opportunities, relationships, and my own well-being. I had turned down a research fellowship in London because David needed me here. I had stopped attending book clubs and faculty gatherings because I couldn't afford the social obligations on my reduced budget. I had been living like a pensioner while funding two people's lifestyle as if I were their personal trust fund. The most damaging evidence came from Emily's own social media accounts. I spent an entire weekend scrolling through her Instagram and Facebook posts, screenshotting the evidence of their actual lifestyle. designer handbags that cost more than my monthly medication budget, weekend trips to Vermont ski resorts that I had unknowingly funded, restaurant dinners where they complained about cheap wine while posting pictures of bottles that cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. In one particularly galling post from Thanksgiving, Emily had shared a photo of herself and David at what looked like an expensive Boston restaurant with the caption, "So grateful for everything we've built together. Living our best life in Beantown. Hashtag blessed, hashtag independent, hashtag young professionals." Independent. The word burned like acid. But the final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbour from the apartment downstairs, knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning with a concerned expression and a plate of homemade dumplings. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said hesitantly, "I don't want to cause trouble, but I think you should know something." She had overheard a phone conversation between David and Emily through the thin walls of our old building. Emily had been talking to someone, presumably her mother, about their living situation. Mrs. Chen's English was heavily accented, but her memory was sharp. "The girl," she say on phone, "we not paying nothing. Old lady pay everything. She feel guilty about David's daddy, so she never say no. Is like having rich parents, but better because no questions asked." Then she laughed very loud. The cruelty of that overheard conversation hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just been taking advantage of me, they had been laughing about it. I was their personal joke, their ATM with feelings, their guaranteed safety net that they could mock in private while performing gratitude in public. That night, I sat in my reading chair, the one Emily hadn't managed to replace yet, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I wasn't going to have a conversation. I wasn't going to give them a chance to manipulate me with tears or promises or threats. I was going to act. But this wasn't going to be a quiet exit or a private confrontation. If they had decided to make my generosity a public performance through social media, then they were going to face the consequences publicly too. I spent the next month planning with the precision of a military operation. First, I contacted a financial advisor who specialized in elder protection. Together, we created a strategy to safeguard my remaining assets and stop the financial hemorrhaging immediately. Next, I reached out to a lawyer who dealt with family exploitation cases. He explained my legal options and helped me draft documents that would protect me from any attempts at retaliation or further manipulation. But the most important part of my plan wasn't legal or financial. It was emotional. I was going to give them exactly what they had given me, a public humiliation that would strip away their carefully constructed image and expose the truth about who they really were. Their engagement party was scheduled for Memorial Day weekend. Emily had been planning it for months, constantly updating me on the guest list that had grown from intimate gathering to what sounded like a wedding reception preview. The venue was the historic Rosecliff Mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, a choice that had raised my eyebrows given their supposed financial constraints, until I realized they weren't paying for it. I was. Emily had presented the costs to me in her usual manipulative style, framing it as a family investment and suggesting that it would be such a shame if they had to cancel because of money. She had even tears in her eyes when she talked about how much it would mean to have their families celebrate together in such a beautiful setting. Like a fool, I had agreed to cover the expenses, the venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography, all funded by the woman they mocked in private and took for granted in public. But what Emily didn't know was that I wasn't just funding their party. I was orchestrating their reckoning. I began reaching out to the guest list, which Emily had helpfully shared with me, so I could coordinate with families. I called David's college friends, Emily's co-workers, distant relatives, and family friends. But I wasn't making small talk. I was conducting interviews. "I'm so excited about David and Emily's engagement," I would begin. "I just want to make sure everyone knows how much love and support has gone into helping them build their life together." The conversations that followed were illuminating. Most people had no idea about the real dynamics of our living situation. They had been told that David was helping take care of his mother, and that Emily was such a blessing, bringing youth and energy into their family home. The narrative they had constructed painted me as the lucky beneficiary of their generosity, not the other way around. But a few people, particularly Emily's co-workers at the television station, inadvertently revealed information that made my blood boil. Emily had been bragging about their rent-free lifestyle and had even suggested to colleagues that they should consider moving in with older relatives as a smart financial strategy. She was advising other people to exploit their elderly family members. By April, I had gathered enough evidence to fill a small filing cabinet. Bank records, social media screenshots, witnessed conversations, legal documents, and most importantly, a detailed timeline of exactly how much money they had cost me and what they had been saying about me behind my back. But I also had something else, a plan that would ensure they faced consequences not just from me, but from everyone they had lied to and everyone they had manipulated through their carefully curated public image. Memorial Day weekend was going to be very educational for everyone involved. The final piece of my strategy came together when I hired a private investigator to verify some of my suspicions about David's supposed job searches. What he found confirmed my worst fears and gave me the ammunition I needed to ensure that no one could dismiss my confrontation as the confused ramblings of an emotional old woman. David hadn't been job hunting for the past year. He had been lying about interviews, creating fake email correspondence, and spending his days playing video games and meeting friends for expensive lunches that I was unknowingly funding. He had turned deception into a full-time occupation. More damaging still, the investigator had discovered that Emily had been skimming money from her part-time job at the television station. Small amounts, but consistent theft that would likely cost her the job if her supervisors found out. She was stealing from her employer while living rent-free off my savings. I now had a complete picture of who these people really were: thieves, liars, and manipulators who had targeted me specifically because they knew I loved David enough to be vulnerable to their tactics. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. As I finalized the last details of my plan, sitting in the kitchen where Emily had mocked my mother's dishes just 4 months earlier, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Not the power to hurt or destroy, but the power to tell the truth and let the consequences fall where they belonged. The engagement party was 3 weeks away, and I was ready. Memorial Day weekend arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes Newport feel like a fairy tale setting. The Rosecliff mansion gleamed white against the blue Atlantic sky, its manicured gardens providing the Instagram-perfect backdrop that Emily had been dreaming about for months. As I walked up the limestone steps in my navy dress, the one I had bought specifically for this occasion, I carried with me a small clutch that contained more than just lipstick and tissues. Inside was a USB drive with 3 years of financial records, printed copies of Emily's most damaging social media posts, and a letter from my attorney confirming the legal steps I had already taken to protect myself. But most importantly, I carried with me a speech that I had been rehearsing for weeks, refining every word until it could cut through their lies like a scalpel. The party was already in full swing when I arrived. Emily floated through the crowd in a white cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. accepting congratulations and posing for photos with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing happiness for social media for years. David stood beside her in a suit I recognized. I had bought it for him last Christmas, smiling the kind of distant smile that had become his default expression whenever family obligations required his presence. The guest list was exactly what I had expected. Emily's co-workers from the television station, David's college friends who had managed to build actual careers, various relatives who showed up to family events but rarely involved themselves in the day-to-day dramas, and a collection of 20-something acquaintances who seemed more interested in the open bar than the happy couple. For the first hour, I played my expected role perfectly. I smiled graciously when people complimented me on David's happiness, nodded politely when Emily's mother gushed about the beautiful venue without acknowledging who had paid for it, and accepted praise for raising such a wonderful son with the appropriate maternal pride. But as the evening progressed and the wine flowed more freely, the masks began to slip. Emily's voice got louder, her gestures more theatrical, and her comments more careless. She was holding court near the champagne fountain, regaling a group of her co-workers with stories about their gorgeous Boston apartment and their incredibly comfortable lifestyle. "We're so lucky," she was saying, her voice carrying across the garden. "David's mother has been such a gem about letting us stay with her while we save up for our own place. Of course, at our age, we really need our space, you know. Living with older people can be so limiting. They have such different ideas about how things should be done." The casual cruelty of her words, describing my financial support as mere permission to stay with me, characterizing my presence in my own home as limiting, was exactly what I had been waiting for. Around her, people nodded sympathetically, probably imagining the difficulty of sharing space with an elderly relative, rather than understanding that they were listening to someone mock her benefactor. That's when I made my move. I had practiced this moment countless times, but as I walked toward the small platform where the band had been playing, my heart was beating so fast I wondered if anyone could hear it. The bandleader looked confused when I asked to borrow the microphone, but something in my expression made him step aside without argument. The feedback from the sound system cut through the chatter like a knife, and gradually, the crowd turned toward me. I could see David's face go pale as he realized what was happening, could see Emily's confused smile freeze as she tried to process why her future mother-in-law was standing on stage with a microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, David's mother, and I wanted to thank you all for being here to celebrate this special occasion." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Emily's smile became more genuine, probably assuming I was about to deliver some conventional maternal blessing that would make her look good on social media. "For those of you who don't know me well," I continued, "I've had the privilege of supporting David and Emily over the past 3 years as they've built their life together. And I do mean supporting them, financially, emotionally, and in every way a mother can." The first hint of unease flickered across some faces. This wasn't sounding like a typical engagement party toast. In fact, I thought it might be interesting for everyone to know exactly how much support has gone into creating the wonderful lifestyle that David and Emily have been enjoying. David was pushing through the crowd now, his face flushed with panic. "Mum, maybe we should—" "No, sweetheart," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth about our family dynamic." I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I had summarized the financial records. Over the past 3 years, I have provided $127,400 in direct financial support to David and Emily. This includes $115,200 in rent for their Boston apartment, which is actually my apartment that I lease for them, $8,300 in car payments, insurance, and maintenance, and approximately $3,900 in what Emily likes to call emergency expenses. The silence was deafening. You could hear the ocean waves hitting the rocks below the mansion. This doesn't include groceries, utilities, dining out, or the cost of tonight's celebration, which I am also funding. I looked directly at Emily, who had gone white as her dress. I thought you might want to know this, since Emily has been telling her co-workers that they should consider moving in with older relatives as a smart financial strategy. Gasps and murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Emily's co-workers were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. The narrative she had constructed about their independent lifestyle was crumbling in real time. But I wasn't finished. I also thought you might be interested to know that David hasn't been job hunting for the past year, despite telling me about interviews almost weekly. And Emily. I paused, letting the silence build tension. Emily has been supplementing her part-time income by stealing small amounts from her employer's petty cash fund. The accusation hit like a bomb. Emily lunged forward, but David caught her arm. "That's not true!" she screamed, but her voice cracked with panic rather than indignation. "Actually, it is true," I said calmly. "I hired a private investigator to verify my suspicions, and I have documentation of everything I've just shared with you, including recordings of conversations where you've mocked me for being too stupid and guilty to say no to your financial requests." The crowd was utterly silent now, watching this family drama unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident. Some guests were already reaching for their phones, whether to call someone or record the scene. I couldn't tell. Emily's supervisor from the television station stepped forward, her face grim. "Emily, we need to talk. Privately. Now." But Emily wasn't going quietly. The mask of sweet, grateful daughter-in-law had completely fallen away, revealing the calculating manipulator underneath. "You bitter old bitch," she snarled, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent garden. "You're just jealous that we have our whole lives ahead of us while you're alone and pathetic. Nobody wants to be around you. That's why your own son had to move in with you." The ugliness of her real character was now on full display for everyone to see. But what hurt more than her words was seeing David's reaction, or lack thereof. Even faced with the complete exposure of their deception, even watching his fiancée verbally abuse his mother in front of 50 people, he said nothing. That silence spoke louder than any defense of Emily could have. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice still calm and clear through the microphone. "I have been alone. I've been alone in my own home while supporting two adults who saw my love as weakness and my generosity as stupidity. But I'm not alone anymore." I gestured to the crowd, many of whom were now looking at David and Emily with expressions of disgust and disbelief. "Everyone here now knows exactly who you are. And more importantly, I know who I am. I'm not your victim anymore." I stepped down from the platform and walked to the exit, my head held high. Behind me, I could hear Emily's voice rising to a shriek as she tried to explain or excuse what had just happened, but her words were lost in the murmur of shocked conversations and the sound of guests quietly gathering their things to leave. David caught up with me in the parking lot, his face streaked with tears. "Mum, please, we can fix this. Emily was drunk. She didn't mean what she said. We can pay you back. We can—" "No," I said, turning to face him one last time. "We can't fix this, David. This isn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is who you chose to become." I handed him an envelope that contained keys to the apartment and a letter from my attorney explaining the legal changes I had already made. You have 30 days to find other arrangements. The apartment lease ends June 1st, and I won't be renewing it. Where are we supposed to go? He asked, and for a moment he looked like the confused little boy I used to comfort after nightmares. I don't know, I said honestly. But for the first time in 3 years, that's not my problem to solve. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of a small cottage in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains turn purple in the sunset. The cottage was nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for one person. But it was mine. Completely, legally, financially mine. The transition hadn't been easy. David and Emily had tried every manipulation tactic in their arsenal. Tears, threats, attempts to turn other family members against me, and even a few pathetic attempts at legal intimidation. But I had been prepared for all of it. My attorney had helped me document everything. The private investigator's evidence had protected me from any attempts at retaliation, and the public nature of their exposure at the engagement party meant that their usual manipulation tactics were useless. Emily lost her job at the television station within a week, just as I had predicted. Her supervisor had been looking for a reason to terminate her employment, and the revelation about the petty cash theft provided the perfect opportunity. David, faced with the reality that his free ride was ending, had finally found motivation to look for actual employment, though his job search was now complicated by the fact that their story had become local gossip in Boston's social circles. They had moved back in with Emily's parents in Providence, an arrangement that lasted exactly 3 weeks before Emily's mother, perhaps finally understanding what I had endured, kicked them out. Last I heard, they were living in a studio apartment in Warwick, both working retail jobs and blaming me for their difficult circumstances. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no guilt either. They were adults facing the natural consequences of their choices, probably for the first time in their lives. As for me, I was discovering what it meant to live for myself again. The cottage in Asheville had come furnished, which was perfect since I had sold most of my Boston furniture rather than pay to move it. I kept only what mattered: my books, my mother's dishes, which looked perfect in my new kitchen, and a few photographs from happier times. I had joined a hiking group for seniors, started volunteering at the local literacy center, and even begun working on a memoir about my experience. The working title was The Price of Unconditional Love, and my editor thought it might help other families recognize and address financial elder abuse before it destroyed their relationships completely. But the most unexpected gift of my new life came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I was browsing in a used bookstore downtown. I was looking for a copy of Jane Eyre to replace the one I had left in Boston, when a familiar voice said, "Maggie? Margaret Sullivan?" I turned around to find Peter Langston, a colleague from my early years at Boston University. We had dated briefly before I met Thomas, and had remained friendly acquaintances throughout my marriage. Peter had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier and had moved to Asheville to be closer to his daughter. "Peter?" I said, genuinely delighted to see a friendly face from my past. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, I suspect," he said with a warm smile. "Starting over." We went for coffee that afternoon and talked for hours about books, teaching, our children, and the strange freedom that comes with rebuilding your life in your 60s. Peter had struggled with his own adult children's expectations after his wife's death, though nothing as dramatic as my situation. "You know," he said, as we walked through downtown Asheville's tree-lined streets, "I always admired your strength back at BU. You had this quiet confidence that I found very attractive. I laughed. I don't feel very confident most days. I feel like I'm learning how to be a person again. Maybe that's what confidence really is, he said. The willingness to keep learning, even when it's scary. 6 months later, Peter asked me to marry him, not because either of us was lonely or desperate, but because we had discovered that love in your 60s can be based on choice rather than need, on mutual respect rather than dependency. Our wedding was small, just his daughter and her family, a few friends from the hiking group, and my new chosen family from the literacy centre. Nobody paid for it except us. Nobody had expectations except our own, and nobody was performing for social media. It was exactly what I hadn't known I wanted. I never heard from David again after that final conversation in the Newport parking lot. He never called to apologize, never reached out to try to rebuild our relationship, never acknowledged that what he and Emily had done was wrong. His silence told me everything I needed to know about who he had become and confirmed that I had made the right choice. Sometimes people ask me if I regret exposing them so publicly, if I wish I had handled it privately to preserve family relationships. The answer is always no. Private conversations would have led to private promises that would have been privately broken. Public exposure ensured public accountability and made it impossible for them to manipulate their way back into my life. More importantly, it sent a message to other potential victims. You don't have to suffer in silence. You don't have to choose between love and respect. And it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. As I sit here now, writing the final chapter of this story, I want to speak directly to anyone who might be living through their own version of my nightmare. Family financial abuse is real, it's common, and it's devastating not just because of the money involved, but because it weaponizes love against its victims. The people who exploit elderly family members know exactly what they're doing. They target our desire to help, our fear of being alone, our worry about being seen as selfish or unloving. They use our own values against us, turning generosity into gullibility and love into leverage. But here's what I learned. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. Protecting yourself isn't selfish. And demanding respect isn't unreasonable. Love without respect isn't love at all. It's exploitation dressed up in family language. If someone in your family is treating your home like a hotel, your bank account like their personal fund, and your feelings like an inconvenience, you are not helping them by enabling their behavior. You are teaching them that love has no limits, which means they will never learn to respect yours. The hardest part of my journey wasn't the financial loss or even the public confrontation. It was accepting that the son I had raised and loved had chosen to become someone I didn't recognize. Grief for the living is sometimes harder than grief for the dead, because it comes with the knowledge that their absence is a choice. But alongside that, grief came an unexpected gift, the discovery that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. At 68, I learned that I could start over, build new relationships, create new traditions, and find happiness that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or gratitude. I learned that chosen family can be more loyal than biological family, that respect must be earned even by your own children, and that it's possible to love someone deeply while still protecting yourself from their destructive choices. Most importantly, I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else is more important than fear. In my case, that something was my own dignity, my own worth, and my own right to live the remainder of my life on my own terms. To anyone facing a similar situation, you are not responsible for fixing adults who choose dysfunction. You are not obligated to fund someone else's lifestyle at the expense of your own security. You are not required to accept disrespect in exchange for family connection. You deserve better, You deserve love that doesn't come with a price tag, relationships that don't require you to diminish yourself, and family connections based on mutual care rather than one-sided obligation. And if those relationships don't exist in your biological family, you have the power to create them elsewhere. It's never too late to choose yourself, to demand better, and to build the life you actually want rather than the one others expect you to provide. The truth is a powerful weapon, but it's also a powerful healer. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending everything is fine and start speaking the truth about what's really happening in your life. Your story matters, your voice matters, your dignity matters. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling destructive behavior and start requiring accountability instead. That's the lesson I learned at 68, standing on a stage in Newport, Rhode Island, with a microphone in my hand and the truth on my lips. It's never too late to reclaim your power, speak your truth, and choose yourself. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever been taken advantage of by family members who confused your love with weakness, if you've ever had to choose between enabling dysfunction and enforcing boundaries, then you're not alone. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below if you've faced similar challenges. Your experiences matter and might help someone else find the courage to speak their truth. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, choosing dignity over family drama, and learning that it's never too late to rewrite the ending of your own story. Because sometimes the most important lesson isn't about forgiveness. It's about recognizing when you deserve better and having the courage to demand it. Remember, your love should be cherished, not exploited. Your generosity should be appreciated, not taken for granted. And your boundaries should be respected, not ignored. You have the right to be valued by the people you value. Never forget that.